Hello everyone, I'm Rajesh Sengupta and we are continuing our discussion on the artistic practices that emerged in the late 20th century, and we have already looked into some of the characteristic features of this newly emergent practices. For example, how they have set up a dialogue between history and contemporaneity, and but at the same time we also see that how that have called for attention from the viewers, from the audience, about how to appreciate art, what are the roles of art in the society, and to what extent we can push the limits of the different kind of expressions, the mediatic expressions. So today we'll be talking about the relevance of the curation, research, and art collaborations, and in them, I mean, we will be initially speak about some of those curatorial projects, and then get into the research component of this kind of collaborations. So by the idea of curation, we find that there have definitely been curators in the mid 20th century. Mostly what we find that in the prominent museums, institutions, and gallery in the Western world, in Europe, in North America, and so on. But perhaps what we understand in terms of what is the role of a curator is to see and to observe, to be sensible, to be sensitive towards different kind of artworks, and then how to bring them together, or how to think about a linkage between them. Or perhaps sometimes we also see that if there is a particular kind of theme, if there is a particular concern, and then how the curator think about bringing the artist to respond to this theme. So curator's role is not always about getting involved into the material practice of making, but their role is about understanding the position of the artist, and also how their works that can respond to certain concerns of our times and from our society. So this kind of concerns we find that in some of the curatorial projects in the as I have already mentioned, in the mid and late 20th century in Western Europe, in North America, and so on. But perhaps one of the first consciously curated show in India would be Place for People by art historian Geeta Kapoor. And Geeta Kapoor, this particular show that had a huge impact in the art scene in India, and of course in entire South Asia. So what we have here, that we find that Geeta Kapoor was also interested in terms of thinking about the relevance of white cube, that is the gallery space, the institutional space, understanding of whether art stands for itself. Should we think about art making is for the appreciation of art, or is there linkages for with the society? So in all this dialogue, where do we think about the role of audiences? In all this dialogue, where do we think the role of ordinary people are? So this kind of issues, we find that those were consciously brought forward in this particular exhibition project called the Place for People. And in this image, as we can see, that there are the participating artists are there, and then Geeta Kapoor wrote the curatorial note for this exhibition, and all the works which were displayed in this exhibition were framed by Geeta Kapoor to how this particular curatorial note, like a manifesto, if I can think about in the early 20th century, would be crucial for understanding the works, or to see the works through the frame of the curator. That is something we find it was a conscious effort as a collaboration between the artist and curator from this project. So this project was in this project we find that some of the artists like Sudhir Patwardhan, then Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh, of course, then Nalini Malani, one of her project we have seen at the beginning of this week's lecture, and then Bhupen Khakkar, this other prolific artist, and then Jogen Chaudhary and Vivan Sundaram. So this all of this artist works we find that they were featured as part of Place for People, and it was considered as a landmark exhibition in the history of South Asian contemporary art. And so from there we find that this exhibitions were this particular exhibition, and then the other exhibition that would also was considered as one of the pioneering exhibition projects, and that was called the Question and Dialogue in 1987. And this also was but that exhibition, I'd say that that had a different flavor from Geeta Kapoor's exhibition, this Place for People. So in this exhibition for Place for People, if we think about like this one particular character, one particular figure of curator, and how the curator is responsible to bring all the works together in this in this exhibition. And all those artists, they were already either they were established or they were in the process of being established in the field of Indian art, but as individual artists, not necessarily as a group, or they did not really work collectively. So that is one point we find, that how they were functioning individually, even though there were dialogues between them, but how they were functioning individually, and then Geeta Kapoor made the effort of bringing their works together to start a new kind of dialogue through these works. Now, what happened with like Question and Dialogue, it was organized by this short-lived group called the Radical Painters, the artist group in Kerala, and this radical artist, we find that they functioned as a group, and this exhibition that was that was conducted, so that came from only from this group. So this is something that we find that they had already an agenda, and they already had a particular aim for making their works collectively, and so that is how the character of this exhibition was different from what we understand for Place for People. So from Place for People, we also find that after 20 years, there was this other exhibition project where multiple curators worked, and that is called the Century City, and that took place in Tate Modern in London in 2001. And in this exhibition, what happened was the themes from various part of the globe, those were given, and those themes were focused around the metropolitan cities. So for this one, what we find that it was the theme of Bombay or Mumbai. So in the 1990s, we also find during this time the more and more discussion came up about keeping the name of the city as Bombay, which was preferred by during the colonial period, and then going back to the name of this place, which was which was perhaps it has its pre-colonial roots, that is Mumbai. So that is how these discussions were shaping up, and during this time we find that the city was renamed as Mumbai. So for that thing, this also gave the curator, the artists, as an opportunity to think about that what we keep from our history, what we shape it differently from the colonial history, and how do we take that further. So for that reason, what we see that this particular depiction of this particular metro city in India, Geeta Kapoor was the one who curated this entire set of works which came to represent the work in in this exhibition. So in the left side we have images of by Bhupen Khakkar. So Bhupen Thakur was not trained in the institutional art practice, but his works, we find that those were humorous, they were also satirical in many parts, and he was perhaps the first or some of among the early openly gay painters or artists in India and in South Asia. And for that reason, that he did not shy away from expressing his view, whereas we find that majority of the society in India to very recent times had reservation towards understanding things which go beyond the heteronormalcy. So those things we find that how Bhupen Thakur's work, which also were featured in Place for People, so they were also important as part of thinking about the artworks from the perspective of a person who's not considered as part of this heteronormative society. And then what different perspective do we see, and does that also allow us to think about the other aspects of life which we do not pay attention to? What are the discriminations that happen to people who do not fit into the society, and also at the same time that what are the directions from these situations? So these are some of the dialogue we find that those perhaps that came forward in Bhupen Thakur's work, and how those also contributed to making of this new metropolitan spaces in India, and the changing or perhaps how the changing perception of the majority towards towards different ways of being. So that came into conversation. The issues around gender, sexuality, and what is normal, what is not, all these ideas came forward with these works. Now the other work that was also featured in this exhibition project, which is by Navjot Altaf, this artist, and this is called Between Memory and History. And in this one, what we find that 1990s also saw the Bombay riots, and certain things that Navjot Altaf had collected memoirs and written notes about the riot, and then various expressions and experiences from people who had survived that, and who have lost their family, who have lost their dear ones, property, and many other things. So those things, what we find that in this particular display, that she had these 3 monitors in which the video concerning her exploration of the theme was played, and then in front of that there was this there was a bar like form like this where it is completely made of iron, and a place which sort of marks a boundary which is certainly not always we associate that with fond memories. So if this is one thing, and then in that we find that all those written notes from various people about their experience, that can be experience of loss, that can be experience about evidencing the riot and this changes in the society during this time. So all those things were then made into this small paper fragments, and then they were inserted within this fence like structure. So what happens that the viewers were invited to see the video, but at the same time the viewers were also invited to take one of those pieces of paper and read it. And in other words, that it was a more participatory kind of work, in which we find that the viewers participation was intended as part of this. And in many the Sufi shrines, in the dargahs, we find that how people keep their wishes in form of written papers, or in form of threads and all, and how those are tied into the shrines of the Sufi saints. So a kind of that gesture is also given here, but then we see that this particular practice which had been there in South Asia for a long time period is then transformed. It's and that practice also has this participatory aspect, but here then like the viewers participation in this work has completely a different view, and through that we get to know about we actually get connected to this unknown people whose experiences are there in the pieces of papers. So this kind of activities we also find that how the curators they bring together various aspects of this and Indian metropolitan cities, like if Bhupen Khakkar's work comment on the issues of gender, sexuality, discrimination, then like Altaf's work talk about the role of community, then violence, and then the need for peace, everything. So this in this way we find that various different aspects of the metropolitan cities or the changing way of lives in India in 2000s or in the 1990s, those were put forward as as depiction of this century city in Tate Modern. So then we also find that in 2007 there was this other exhibition project which is called Horn Plays at the Kunstmuseum in Bern, and there was a revisiting of these two pioneering exhibitions, that is Place for People and Questions and Dialogue. So Place for People from 1981 and then Question and Dialogue from 1987. So these two exhibitions were revisited in this curatorial project in 2007 at the Kunstmuseum, and so what we see there in that exhibition, that some of the artists like Ghulam Sheikh, Atul Dodia, all of them they had commented on this issue of narrativity, and then there's this idea of narrativity and making of narrative art that had been there, and it had created much debate in the post 1947 in India, and so for that reason we also find how the progressive artist group they have deliberately moved from making narratives. So from there we find that how those things are then sort of compared, and those were taken to a different perspective when this revisiting of these exhibitions took place in the Kunstmuseum. Now from there we also find that this another exhibition project that I won't say it's an exhibition project. This is a much more a bigger scale in terms of how the project was conceived, and that is the first Biennale of India. So the Biennales are the ones in they happen once in 2 years, and we find that there were already international print Biennales or Trinales, and Biennales, the international ones like the Venice Biennale and so on, where they showcased artworks from various different parts of the globe, and in a way that those kind of biennales, they become the hub for all people who are interested in contemporary art to visit that site once in 2 years and have those extended conversation dialogues, at the same time the viewing of artwork from across the world. So that was there in the 20th century art practices, but in India what we find that that was something that started in 2012 and in form of Kochi Biennale. So Kochi Biennale, as we can see that there are some of the posters here we have on screen, and these posters were the way they sort of also popularized the Biennale in Kerala. That we see that it was called as the India's first Biennale, but also that some of the posters, like for example here what we see that people who do not really look like the like the so-called the elite gallery goers. They are the ones who hold the poster, like India's first Biennale, and this is a gesture towards calling attention to a more inclusive experience of viewing, which will not just be relegated to the gallery going audience or the people who go to museum for viewing artworks. So in other words, I can say that how the starting of the Biennale and the need for extended attention, at the same time participation of the audience and public, was something that was kept in mind for starting of this Biennale in India, and how they have thought that, I mean, this is indispensable. It cannot just be exclusive to a few handful of gallery goers, but it needs to engage a larger society, a larger group of people, in order to survive, to sustain, and to flourish. And so those things we find that was prioritized from the very first Biennale in India. And here what we find that in Biennale, that it is not just the artworks which are brought from different artists and different part of the globe to the site and then displayed, but there were also projects in which we find the site specific works were developed. Now, what is site specific work? So the site specific works also started perhaps from the 1970s, 1980s. We find when land art in part of Europe and in North America that got its prominence, and we would see that, I mean, how the artist, they have their ideas, they have their practice, but when they arrived in a particular site, how do they respond to that site, the site as a space, a site where people are already there, a site where there are objects and objects with history. So how their practice, the artist practice, can be can be sort of like, I mean, transformed or made into something that fits this particular site. That is called the site specific work that we see. And it's also, in a way, it's a way to sort of question this idea of artist individuality, because as we can see that in the modernist regime, this idea of artist individual approach towards making artworks, and which may or may not respond to the changing norms of society, socio-political situations and everything. Those things were there, and developing a particular style of work more than anything else, that was also something that was given priority for particular given time. So the site specific works, we find that certainly marks a departure from that. It compels the artist, or it gives opportunity to the artist to move beyond this established norms, that if they have already established a particular way of making works, what are the ways in which one can question that, they can push their own boundaries and make works which are fresh in their approach, at the same time that can also be a learning experience for the artists themselves. So this is one project that I wanted to show here, and this the Kochi Biennale, the place of the Biennale, which is very close to the Harbour area, and here we see the Vallarpadam container terminal, which was in the making, and that is one of the that is a huge container terminal in this vicinity of Kochi. So this particular place is there, and then one of the sites for displaying the work that we see, which is like right adjacent to this Vallarpadam container terminal. So from this windows you can actually see this ships and part of the terminal. So the artist who had worked here in this place in 2012, and that is Prasad Raghavan, so he had incorporated this image of the ship as part of the work. So this is called the ship of Tarshish, and this ship with all those like those containers on the top of them, which gives specificity to this site that was made here in the interior. So when we see this ship in the interior as an artwork, and then from the window we actually see the ships which are on the move, so what kind of dialogue that creates, and that is something that question, I mean, perhaps, I mean, more than a conclusive answer that is put forward by the artist. And also when we see a particular this ship within this institutional space or a gallery space or a display space, then we start considering it as an artwork. When the same ship, if we see through the window which is on the move, could we consider that as an artwork? So this kind of complicated questions are also put forward by creating a dialogue between what is already there and what is constructed within this given space. So that kind of activities, I think, I mean, that also added to the complexity, at the same time the layered understanding of the contemporary Indian art and the artists' participations. So we'll continue more on this works. At the same time, we'll get into more of the participatory works in the next lecture. Thank you.